Yep.
So, yeah, not Q&A.
Okay.
Just the, yeah.
Cool.
Yep. All right, everybody, last presenter of the day, please welcome Sisu Lang.
All right. My name is Cece Lang, and this is my capstone presentation on the authenticity of Robert Eggers' adaptation of the Danish saga of Amleth. So, when most people are asked to think about something when the Vikings are mentioned, there are obviously a few common things that come to mind. James McMahon, in his 2021 article, Thrills and Gut Spills, Why Have Vikings Taken Over Popular Culture, suggests that people commonly associate violence, toughness, brotherhood, and just a general lawlessness with the Viking Age. And this is because of how Vikings are portrayed in our modern TV and films, such as shows like Vikings, Vikings Valhalla, Norsemen, How to Train Your Dragons, and many others. We are also constantly exposed to Vikings in every day in the forms of the names from tough sports teams to strong steel manufacturing companies that also help with the prevalence of these stereotypes. States Parson 2023. But all of this exposure commonly misrepresents the Vikings. For example, these shows depict a great deal of violence, which, yes, is something that the Vikings were and did, but it isn't their whole culture. Neil Price, in his 2022 book, Children of Ash and Elm, heavily conveys the message that while the Vikings were violent, and yes, they did raid and pillage and burn and were a large trader in slaves, that wasn't all that the Vikings were. They were also very skilled craftsmen, carpenters, sailors, and merchants, and this is something that we must represent when we try to depict the Vikings on film. But instead of doing that, these shows continue to portray these negative stereotypes. They also tend to add other genres to films about Vikings to make them more engaging to the modern audience, like that of a pirate or a cowboy. Finally, these shows also change historical facts, like in the show Vikings, which is agreed to be a fairly historically accurate TV show. One of the main characters is known to have lived like 80 years after the show is actually set, yet they put him in the show just to make it more engaging to audience, and this causes people to misinterpret historical facts and get them completely wrong about the Viking Age. All of this misrepresentation, stereotyping, and exposure, as I stated, have very negative impacts. Concluded Nicole Barbaro in their 2024 paper, Reimagining Vikings, the Evolution and Impact of Viking Imagery in Contemporary Fiction and Media, where they state, quote, "This process simplifies or distorts the Viking image, reducing it to a stereotypical warrior archetype or commercial symbol devoid of cultural value. This global appropriation and commodification of the historical figure of the Viking can undermine cultural authenticity, as the nuanced and multifaceted nature of the Viking is often lost in translation." But there is one film that does the opposite of this, and that is The Northman, directed by Robert Eggers and released in 2022. And The Northman is possibly The most historically and culturally accurate film depicting Vikings to date, states Betty W. 2022, Perry DM 2022, and Connell S. 2022. Everything from the swords and clothes to the buildings and the blurry background are based off of actual historical artifacts from the Viking Age and Viking archaeological sites. But the Northman isn't an original story by Eggers. He has stated publicly and in an interview with Times Magazine reporter Shannon Carlin that it was based off of the Saga of Amleth. So what is the Saga of Amleth? Well, originally called Amleth, Prince of Denmark, it was written by Saxo Grammaticus in 1185 CE in his Gastra Damorum, or Deeds of the Danes, which was Saxo's history of Denmark up until that point. And it follows the revenge arc of the main character, Amleth, through his life. And it has an eerie mirror to that of Shakespeare's play Hamlet, which is agreed by many historians to be a later adaptation of it for a different audience. This led me to my research question. How closely does the movie The Northman, directed by Robert Eggers and released in 2022, follow the original Saga of Amleth, written by Saxo Grammaticus in 1185 CE? The methods for my research, I use an intertextual analysis and compare the original writing of Amleth, Prince of Denmark by Saxo to The Northman, directed by Robert Eggers. While intertextual comparisons are commonly used for comparing two pieces of text, Kesslet I 2024 used it in their paper, This War Will Never Be Forgotten, a study of intertextual relations between Homer's Iliad and Wolfgang Petersen's Troy, where they did the exact same thing that I'm doing. So, while conducting my research, I read the original work and watched the film. And while doing so, I looked at the plot points, people's places, people's names, the order of things happened of the two pieces, and I tried to see where they diverged or where they were similar. I also looked at key elements that both pieces praise and things that both stories value. And in doing so, I tried to ascertain what the film changed about the original story. My gap for this research is that many authors have looked at the historical and cultural accuracy of the movie The Northman, and they've also done this with many other shows. And also, people have looked at the intertextual relations between shows that are based off of an older text and their modern counterpart in the film. But no one's ever done a complete one of this with The Northman. Going into this, I had some assumptions in that the film would be not very similar to the original text at all, considering that it's a modern film involving Vikings, and there's a lot of cultural stereotypes around the Vikings. And it would be similar to what Wolfgang Petersen did with Troy. So my results. In my comparison, I found that at face value, the stories weren't in fact the same. In Amleth, Prince of Denmark, Amleth's father is a king or petty king in Denmark who is murdered by his uncle who takes the kingdom because he's jealous. Amleth then is forced to pretend to be insane in order to survive his uncle's wrath. And when he grows up, he goes to Britain for a year, marries the princess, comes back, and then takes revenge on his uncle. And then he goes on a whole side quest where he marries the Queen of Scotland, comes back to Denmark, and then dies soon after. This is compared to the movie The Northman, where it starts with the same plot point, where Amleth's father is murdered by his uncle, but instead of being in Denmark, it is in the island kingdom of Rafsea in Iceland. And instead of pretending to be insane, Amleth escapes right after his father is murdered, swearing to avenge his father, save his mother, and kill his uncle. And then we find him years later as a berserker on a raiding ship in the Rus, where he is reminded of his oath to avenge his father, and he goes back to Iceland, disguises himself as a slave on his uncle's farm, and eventually takes his revenge and dies soon after on top of a flaming volcano. Pretty epic. So both stories, in my analysis, I found that both stories share the same key plot points. Amleth's father is murdered, he survives till he's older with cunning, intelligence, and by disguising himself, and he fulfills his oath of revenge and dies soon after. So the overarching plots are the same. And they're also driven by the same thing: revenge for a father murdered by an uncle, loss of the kingdom, and one of the most important things is love for one's mother. because in both stories, Amleth really wants to save his mother because his uncle has taken her for his wife, and that is wrong. Similarly to the overarching plot, the names of all the main key characters are also the same. In both stories, Amleth is Amleth. His father in the original is Harwindil, and in the film is Arvindil. His mother is Guthra and Gudrun, and then the only spot that the names really diverge is that of the uncle, which in the original is Fang, and in the film is Fjolnir. And this makes sense, because the film is set in Iceland, and Fjolnir is an Icelandic name. So Eggers wanted to make his film make sense. Seeing as it's set in Iceland, he gave one of the main characters an Icelandic name to make that more flow better. The main spot that the films diverge is the subplot. As we can see here, this is a map of where Amleth travels in the original story on the left, and this is a map of where he travels in the film. Completely different. But where the story happens doesn't really matter. All that really matters is that Amleth's father is killed, and he needs to take revenge on it. Another few key things that I found is that the stories do indeed share common values, which is also really important. They share honor, loyalty to one's oaths, and also praise of intelligence and cunning, but a little bit less in the film. One thing that the film doesn't share with the original work is honesty, because in the original work, Amleth never tells a lie, which is not something that he does in the film, but that was something that was really important to the Vikings at the time. There's also references to the original work in the film, like a line when Amleth is getting his prophecy that he will avenge his father one day. There's a line, "At every passage, one should turn his eye around, one should spy around, for a foe might be crouched within upon the floor. Wise in measure each man should be, yet wise enough to be a fool." And this is a reference to one of the trials that Amleth has to go through to prove that he's actually insane, when in fact he's not, and that Fang hid a spy in the floor underneath some hay to see if Amleth stopped pretending, or was pretending to be insane and stopped around his mother. And it also directly mentions the fact that in the original Amleth is insane, or pretending to be. So what do these results mean? Well, it can be boiled down to this simple statement. Eggers changed the story to appeal to a modern audience, while keeping the main recognizable skeleton of Saxo's writing. This is evident by the fact that the general plots and names are the same, and they're driven by the same things. And like in the time of the Vikings, when they would tweak their sagas to appeal to a different audience in a different location at a different time, Eggers did the same thing. He changed Amleth's story in order to do that. He also added things that would appeal to a modern audience, particularly violence. And this is something that we expect to see when we go into a movie theater and we watch a film about Vikings. But despite adding things that modern audiences would like and changing the story to fit a modern audience, the film did in fact gross under its budget. And this shows that even though his attempts were good at trying to do this, they didn't actually land with our modern audience that really wants to see violence when they see Vikings. Some limitations that I had during this study is I do not speak Danish or Icelandic, so comparing the names was kind of hard for me to do, but eventually I ended up having to just look at the spellings and then listen to the pronunciations in Google Translate, and that could have some limitations as to, like, I could have potentially gotten it wrong. Also, in the maps of where the main character travels, specific locations are rarely mentioned, so the maps could honestly be completely wrong, but they're more for a visualization of where the stories differ. Implications of this, even though I looked at only one film compared to its original story, it has large implications as to how films of similar genre and origin, so those based off of historical text or cultural text, like the Iliad, like Danish sagas or Viking sagas, or any other cultural story from around the world, are created. in order to maximize profit and also cultural and historical authenticity. So, in conclusion, Eggers made the story of Amleth his own, but he still managed to keep the ideas and essence of Saxo's work, which is the important part. Yes, the film is much more violent than the original story, but it isn't romanticized, which is what Neil Price said is one thing that we shouldn't do when we're trying to portray Vikings on screen. Instead, the violence opens up a window to a modern audience who up until this point has seen nothing but romanticized violence when portraying Vikings. And instead, Eggers really showed the brutality of it and how it negatively affects everyone that is involved. We also get to see the multifaceted and nuanced essence of the Vikings, like Barbaro said that we should do when portraying them on screen. We see every side of their culture, from their worship of gods to their belief in spiritual and otherworldly beings. This is also something that both stories really share in common. So in future, films that attempt to do the same thing need to walk a very careful line when they're trying to adapt an original text in order to properly represent the work and make the film culturally and historically accurate and also sensitive, and not portray negative stereotypes. Thank you for watching. These are my image sources, and references are available upon request. Questions?
How did you come across this topic?
So originally, growing up, I had a large fascination with the Vikings, and I kind of really hated to see how they were improperly depicted in modern films. And when I would try to go up to someone, and they'd be like, and I'd try to tell them about a saga, they're like, oh wait, are those the guys with horns on their helmets? I was like, no, not really. And when I was preparing to do my AP research project, I really wanted to look at how historical inaccuracies are portrayed, but that has been done extensively. So instead, I remembered that I watched this really cool film that just came out a little bit ago about Vikings, and I knew that it was based off of an Icelandic saga, or a Danish saga, and I was like, okay, is there a way that I can see what the film changed from the original saga and how it portrays that, the ideas?
I have a question. I'm not familiar with the myth of Amleth. Is that a super popular and familiar myth in Danish culture or in Scandinavian culture?
It's fairly big in Denmark, but it's actually much larger in Iceland because a long time after Saxo wrote it down, it was translated into Icelandic, so it's also probably more commonly known in Iceland as one of the Icelandic sagas, but originally it was Danish. Similar, yeah. I actually, after doing this project, I was listening to NPR, and there was a guy talking about growing up in Iceland, and he mentioned this saga as one of the ones that he grew up with. So, yeah.
So Sisu, I know you only had 15 minutes. Can you tell us a little bit more about your method of analysis between the actual saga and the movie?
Yeah. I consume both pieces of media, and doing that with the Danish saga was actually really hard because it's not coherently written at all, and it's really old or older English. But when I was watching the film and then reading the saga, I was really focusing on the general overarching plot and where those were similar as well, and trying to compare that, how many years after this event did this event happen, when exactly does this event happen, who's present at each event, is the mother involved, is the father involved, and stuff like that. But I was also really looking at what each story values, because Wolfgang Petersen in Troy just focuses on the violence of raiding Troy and all of that, because that's what we want to see. And he kind of brushes over like what the original meaning of the work was. So I was really trying to see whether the original meaning matched that of the film, and how like the film changed that. Yep.
You mentioned how modern films, this one in particular, like to see violence in Vikings. When did this stereotype, or at least want from our culture to see violence from Vikings, when did this arise?
So I didn't look too much into when this stereotype originally arose, but in my research I was finding papers from the 80s who were looking at like old films about the Vikings from the 80s and earlier, and this was a common thing that was associated with them as well. And also, and this probably arose due to the fact that a lot of the historical texts that we have about the Vikings are references or logs of like when raids happened, and we're just like, oh, all the Vikings did was raid, and thus violence, and now we're beginning to like unearth their archaeological sites and being like, okay, wait, this was only a thing that they did once in their lifetimes, and they're actually more farmers and tradesmen.
So you mentioned reading the original saga being difficult. Did you, A, how long did it take you to read it? And then B, what kind of systems did you come up to combat that?
I think it took me about a week of really hard in class, and then like a long time after school, like multiple hours after school. And so the system that I developed is like I initially read through it and was like, okay, cool, I kind of understand what's going on. And then I reread through it and like fully analyzed each line and each part of the text and was like, okay, I misunderstood that in my initial reading, and now I have a fuller understanding. So yeah, it was time consuming and tedious.
I'm wondering if you could speak as to the value of modern retellings of traditional cultural stories in general.
So yeah, I kind of touched on this in my conclusion, but the value of it is that we get to see what the Viking Age was actually like. So one of the big things that made the Northmen really unique is that instead of focusing just on the violence, it showed all of the things that the Vikings did in their day-to-day life, like all their sacrifices, all their beliefs, and everything that the Vikings actually valued and would have been part of their world. So there's a lot of mentions of like mythological things happening or supernatural things happening that generally we don't see when we think of depictions of Vikings. So that's why understanding these old texts and telling them to a modern audience is important, because then we can hopefully combat the stereotypes of what these people were actually like. And this goes for every culture around the world. Thank you.